This is episode 386 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special insider history extras, including bonus episodes and special visual history for every episode. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned for even more details.
Hi, I'm Robert Stefanik, Assistant Professor of English and Fine Arts at the U.S. Air Force Academy and author of a forthcoming book, Coriolanus and the Death of the Human. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
So if we entertain the possibility that Susanna and Judith wrote Anne's epitaph because it's addressed from a child to a mother, it would then be the only surviving Shakespearean text written by women.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Anne Hathaway Shakespeare outlived her famous husband by 7 years, dying on August 6, 1623, the same year William Shakespeare's friends published the first folio, immortalizing the works of Anne's husband for posterity. Buried next to William in Holy Trinity Church, Anne is lovingly remembered by a Latin epitaph, written most likely by her daughters. Along with the epitaph being written by women in a period when it was a rarity to find women writing, the epitaph's construction and word choice offer a glimpse into the life of a famous woman whose memory is something of an enigma for modern historians. This week, we are delighted to welcome Katherine Scheil back to That Shakespeare Life to tell us about this epitaph and how it is unique among burial memorials from Shakespeare's lifetime. Katherine Scheil is professor of English at the University of Minnesota. She is the author of several books about Shakespeare, including her latest work about the epitaph of Anne Hathaway Shakespeare, called Anne Shakespeare's Epitaph. Find links to this work and more on Katherine in the show notes for today's episode. Before we get into our conversation today, I want to let you know that there's coordinating visual history content about epitaphs from Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as about Anne Hathaway Shakespeare herself, including period illustrations, museum artifacts, and photographs of the different graves that we're talking about in our show today, all packed into the bonus content for patrons of our show. You can find these extras by clicking on the detailed show notes button on our regular show notes page. The URL for where to find those this week is CassidyCash.com/386. That's CassidyCash.com/386. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Katherine. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. It's really nice to get to talk with you again.
Great, thanks. It's wonderful to be here.
How does Anne Hathaway Shakespeare's epitaph compare with those of her husband and daughters? I mean, they're all buried there together in Holy Trinity Church, but is there a theme for how they are memorialized?
Let me set the scene a little bit for your listeners. So there are 5 Shakespeare graves in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, all on the chancel steps. If you're standing facing the altar from left to right, they're Anne Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, Thomas Nash, that's the first husband of Susanna Hall's daughter, Elizabeth, John Hall, and then Susanna Shakespeare Hall. Anne's other daughter, Judith Shakespeare Quiney, is buried outside the church in the churchyard for unknown reasons. So I think you have to invite Lori McGuire here to talk a little bit about that. So now to the actual graves. So Shakespeare's grave, as we know, only has the famous curse on it. There's no name or other identifying information. The other 3 graves, Thomas Nash, John Hall, and Susanna Hall, are all similar. They all have a coat of arms at the top and then an epitaph below. All 4 of the other Shakespeare graves, except for Anne's, are incised slabs, meaning the inscription is cut directly into the stone. Anne's is the outlier, which is why I've been interested in it for a long time. It's the only Shakespeare grave that has a brass plaque on it with an epitaph written in Latin. And there are several significant things about this epitaph. First is the location. Anne Shakespeare was the first member of the Shakespeare family to be buried on the chancel steps after her husband, William. The chancel is the most sacred part of the church, and Anne's survivors would have had to pay a significant amount for the burial space. It wasn't automatic that she would be buried there. And she's placed in between the monument to Shakespeare on the wall and his grave. Shakespeare's monument would have been in place when Anne died in 1623, since Leonard Digges refers to thy Stratford monument in his dedication to the 1623 First Folio. Second, her survivors took care to memorialize her in brass, which was a more permanent substance than stone. So I think the choice of brass as opposed to stone held particular significance for the Shakespeare family. Ben Jonson's verses to the reader in the First Folio, those appear on the page facing the Droeshout engraving of Shakespeare, were likely composed about the same time as Anne's death. And Jonson refers to being writ in brass as the second best way to immortalize Shakespeare, other than collecting his works. Shakespeare himself in Sonnet 107 similarly talks about poetry as the only monument that endures longer than the strong material of tyrants' crests and tombs of brass. So for the Shakespeare family, the choice of brass was significant. And again, it's the only Shakespeare grave that has a brass plaque. Then to the really important thing. So we've got the chancel burial in the most sacred part of the church, the brass plaque, and then Anne's survivors, her daughters Susanna and Judith, created an original epitaph in Latin poetry. So Anne's epitaph has actually two parts. It starts with an English part, which is really boilerplate, and that's really what you would expect. So the top section is in English, and it positions Anne as the wife of William Shakespeare. So it reads, "Here lieth interred the body of Anne, wife of William Shakespeare, who departed this life the 6th day of August, 1623, being of the age of 67 years." I think if Anne had been the disastrous mistake that some biographers make her out to be, that would have been the end of her epitaph. Just name, date, wife of William Shakespeare, end of story.
Oh, well, yeah. And they probably would not have gone to the expense of placing her where they did.
Right, right. So the expense of brass, the expense of a chancel burial, and then the Latin part of the epitaph is really significant. So here's what it reads in translation. "You, mother, gave your breasts milk and life. Woe is me, in return for so great a gift, I shall give rocks. How I'd prefer, I would pray, that the good angel should move the stone away, and out would come, like the body of Christ, the image of you. But prayers are of no avail. Come quickly, Christ. She shall rise again, my mother, although she has been shut in the tomb, and she shall seek the stars." So we've got
Oh my goodness, that tugs at your heartstrings. Like
doesn't it?
As a mom, you're like, oh wow, I'm
Exactly.
gonna cry.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, why was it important for it to be written in Latin and not in English?
That's a really good question. So I think we might start by saying that epitaphs themselves would have been really important to the Shakespeare family. Shakespeare himself mentions epitaphs more frequently in his plays and poems than any other contemporary playwright. The word epitaph appears in his work 17 times. So if we entertain the possibility that Susanna and Judith wrote Anne's epitaph because it's addressed from a child to a mother, it would then be the only surviving Shakespearean text written by women. Now to your question of why it's in Latin. So if Susanna and Judith were responsible for the creation of the epitaph, then the choice of Latin would also have been theirs. So there are a couple things to think about with the choice of Latin. First, it would have restricted the ability of many people to actually read the epitaph. So I think that deliberate choice had a downside in that it would not have been available to anyone who could read. But I think they must have balanced that with the prestige that using Latin would have given to their mother, and I think also to the content of the epitaph itself. So the choice of Latin would have elevated the subject of Anne, even if it meant that fewer people would actually be able to read it.
So it was just another way to honor her, right along with the location and the brass. They're just really wanting people to remember her as having been a very special person. I wonder if it has anything to do with a nod to her having educated them in terms of how to read and write also, because as women, wouldn't they have learned that from her to be able to write it in Latin?
Right, absolutely. So I think it's a significant testament to Anne as a mother in all of the various roles of motherhood. And it's been on the chancel steps of Holy Trinity since at least the 1630s, kind of hidden in plain sight. You have this amazing testament to Anne as a mother that elevates her by the choice of Latin.
Well, now that we know what the epitaph says, what's significant about all that it's talking about? I mean, I was surprised when you said they were going to give her rocks. I think I'd like to know more about some of those things, like why rocks? And what was significant about the other statements they're making about her there?
Well, I think also, according to the conventions of writing epitaphs, they were expected to be true about the person commemorated. So I think whatever this epitaph says, there was a convention that it's a reflection of Anne herself. The opening words of the Latin section, ubera, which is breasts, and mater, which is mother, eulogize Anne as a breastfeeding mother who gave milk and life. So that's a tribute that would have signaled Anne's achievements as a mother, but also as a devout person. The practice of breastfeeding was considered, according to William Gouge in his 1622 work of Domestical Duties, as what he described as a testimony of love and an example of the admirable work of God's providence. Other ideas of breastfeeding from the period, John Dodd and Robert Cleaver, in A Godly Form of Household Government, describe a good mother as one who nursed her own children. And Elizabeth Clinton in 1622 put it more bluntly, breast milk comes from direct providence of God. So I think Susanna and Judith's decision to foreground Anne as a breastfeeding mother was a shorthand to characterize her as a virtuous and dutiful mother. Interestingly, both Susanna and Judith were mothers at the time of Anne's death. So I think the elevation of motherhood in Latin poetry on the chancel steps in brass would have been personally significant to them. But it's also really significant in terms of the placement of Anne's grave as well. So if you think about where it's nestled on the chancel steps in between Shakespeare's monument and his own grave, you've got both of those testimonies to, the greatest writer. And in between that, you've got this amazing testimony in Latin to a mother, to a life-giving mother, as equally important.
I think about the expression behind every great man is an amazing woman. I have to think there's a little bit of that imagery there, not to wrap the whole world into that image, of course, but that expression of the path from being William to being memorialized was supported by Anne, who's in the middle.
Right. Interestingly, the Latin section doesn't refer to her as the wife of Shakespeare at all.
I was hoping you were going to explain that. Yeah, because it doesn't. And that's a pretty normal thing to reference somebody as wife of this or husband of whoever. And they don't draw attention to that at all.
Right. We've got it in the English part, but in the Latin section, the original Latin poetry that must have derived from Anne's daughters, they're focusing on her as a mother. I mean, it must have been a remarkable statement for them to say, on the chancel steps in our parish church in brass, we are eulogizing her as a mother. I mean, it's just a remarkable statement.
Well, do we know who it was that actually did the carving to put it into the brass? Because we know, of course, Susanna and Judith were the authors of what it says, but who did the physical craftsmanship there?
I think we do know, at least I make a case that we know. So according to contemporary practice, a brass epitaph like Anne's would have been produced in London, not in Stratford or Warwickshire. And the attribution of a brass epitaph like Anne's is done by stylistic comparison, which of course is impossible for me to do on a podcast. So I think you and your listeners are just going to have to take my word for it here. When you look at the visual evidence, it's clear that Anne's epitaph was created by a man named Edward Marshall. He was a distinguished London sculptor and mason with a long career from the 1620s through the 1660s. He did Michael Drayton's monument in Westminster Abbey. He did the Totnes Monument in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. He was also appointed Master Mason to the Crown from 1660 until his death in 1675.
So they didn't skimp. They didn't go get, just some friend of a friend. They went and found somebody who was established and was going to do this really well. And they went to some expense to have it done in London and then transported to Stratford as well, where it could be used where we see it.
Exactly. And I think that choice to enlist a top-notch engraver rather than someone who was local and who would have been second rate, kind of a local hack engraver, like that was a significant choice on the part of Anne's survivors as well.
Well, how does identifying the engraver give us more details about Anne and her world? What does that bring to light about her?
I think in addition to the fact that Edward Marshall was a prominent engraver, it's really important about where his shop was located. So his shop was in the churchyard of St. Dunstan's in the West, which is off of Fleet Street and Fetter Lane in London. Ben Jonson calls St. Dunstan's the home of Shakespeare publishing in the 1620s and 1630s, and it was a key location for printing of Shakespeare's texts as late as the 1640s. So just to give one example of the significance of where Edward Marshall's shop was located, John Smithick was the most active publisher of Shakespeare at St. Dunstan's, and Marshall's relationship with Smithick is a remarkable possible link between Anne and the literary community of London. Smithick was a long-standing bookseller and publisher of Shakespeare's writing. He's listed in the colophon of the First Folio, and he held the publishing rights to Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Love's Labour's Lost, and The Taming of the Shrew. So he definitely would have known Edward Marshall. So both of those two individuals would have been linked. Smithick also played a major role in the distribution of Shakespeare's plays throughout the 1630s. He was also involved in the publication of the Second Folio in 1632. So both Smithick and Edward Marshall were also active parishioners in St. Dunstan's in the West. Edward Marshall moved to the parish in late 1628 or 1629. John Smithick would have been the parish church warden at the time. He had just paid John Donne to preach an Easter sermon there in 1628. Smithick was also elected constable in 1619, became a junior church warden in 1627, and then a senior church warden in 1628. And Edward Marshall was equally active there throughout his life. So the fact that Marshall's shop was located in really close proximity to the Shakespeare publishing hub connects the engraver to this whole London literary world. John Smithick also knew Michael Drayton. He was the publisher for several of Drayton's works, including Drayton's 1619 folio. So it's really intriguing to think about the possible connections between Edward Marshall and the whole literary world of 17th century London because they intersect in that churchyard. Matt Stagel's recent work, which places Anne Shakespeare in London in the early 17th century, is another connection that brings Anne out of Stratford and into the orbit of literary life in London.
Yes. Oh my gosh. My mind was blown by his recent letter fragments that he was talking about. And he's going to be on the podcast to talk about those. So we'll link you to that in the show notes for today as a companion to, now that you know more about Anne's engraving, you can learn about her time in London as well. But I never would have thought that there would have been quite so much history to uncover about an epitaph. You think it's just an engraving on their grave and it's interesting, but there you are. But yet there's all of this history that blossoms out from exploring that more in depth, which I know we are now very excited to dive into. So if we're new to this kind of history and we want to explore the history of Anne's epitaph further, what are some good places we should start to learn more?
I would recommend 4 things. First, Matt Stagel's new article about this fragment of a letter linking Anne Shakespeare to possibly living in London. I would recommend Lena Orland's amazing book, The Private Life of William Shakespeare, which is just a model of scholarly inquiry and just amazing research. Ben Higgins's book, Shakespeare's Syndicate, which unlocks the whole publishing community in both St. Paul's and St. Dunstan's in the West. And then Chris Lotoris's book, Shakespeare's Book. And I know Chris has been a frequent guest here on your show as well.
Yes, he has. We have enjoyed having him visit. And I will link to all of these wonderful suggestions in the show notes for today's episode so that you can see those. And we'll link to the related podcast episodes as well. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL to find all of these lovely extras for today. Now, Katherine, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those, and as an add-on from your last visit with us, because I know you have already selected one book for your desert island, but you may also take a luxury item if you would like, because I've since been informed that the original Desert Island Disc show, which this question was inspired by, did actually allow guests to take a luxury item. So you may select a luxury item as well if you would like.
I hadn't thought about that, but I would probably actually bring a blank book to take some notes. If I had the opportunity on a desert island in isolation and solitary contemplation, it would be great to just take some notes from reading all of Shakespeare's works. Like, that would be an amazing opportunity. Luxury item, I'd probably bring a good bottle of wine just to be able to thoroughly enjoy the experience.
Absolutely. I think that would be an excellent way to spend your time on your deserted island for sure. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm working on two books, one about the history of women in Stratford-upon-Avon, and a second book that's a work about biofiction called Father Shakespeare.
Oh, that's fascinating. Is that about Shakespeare as a dad or about Shakespeare's actual father?
So it's about the idea that Shakespeare is a father in biofiction, but also Shakespeare as the father of the literary canon and how those two things intersect.
Gotcha. Well, we will look forward to seeing both of these come to fruition. Thank you so much for being here with us this week to take us through the history of Anne Hathaway Shakespeare's Epitaph and helping us understand that even more. I really appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Great. Thanks, Cassidy. It's always a pleasure to be your guest.
Detailed links to more information about our guest this week, along with the resources Katherine recommends that you use to learn more about the history of Anne Hathaway and her epitaph in Holy Trinity Church, are all available on the podcast website this week at CassidyCash.com/episode 386. While you're there, be sure to check the detailed show notes button for more in-depth visual history related to Anne Hathaway Shakespeare, including images of the epitaph, translations, and more. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 386. How would you like to go one step further into the life of William Shakespeare and actually try out some of the history you learn about here on the podcast? You can try your hand at making recipes, playing games, and building crafts from Shakespeare's lifetime inside Experience Shakespeare on Patreon. You can complete hands-on history activity kits that work like science labs for Shakespeare history, including how to make Hippocras wine, how to play the card game Naughty that shows up in Two Gentlemen of Verona, as well as how to make your own iron gall ink and so many more. All of our activity kits come with instructions, supply lists, video tutorials, and a bonus history guide so you can try out at home a piece of the history you learn about on our show with items you may already have at home or can easily find at a local market or store. With a library of Renaissance activity kits covering games, recipes, and crafts from the 16th and 17th century, Experience Shakespeare is the best place to cook, play, and create your way through the life of William Shakespeare. Get started right now at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.